At just 9 years old, Emily found herself in the hospital, her small body trembling, not from illness, but from the secret she carried. 7 months pregnant, her childlike innocence starkly contrasted the weight of what she bore. The truth behind her situation was a silent storm, one that no child should ever have to face. The emergency room was eerily quiet, the stillness of the night broken only by the occasional beep of a monitor or the shuffle of a nurse's footsteps. Dr. Sarah Green sat at her desk, reviewing the night's cases. Another typical shift, or so it seemed. But then the doors swung open, and the paramedics wheeled in a small, fragile figure. Emily lay motionless on the stretcher, her dark hair matted against her forehead, her eyes wide open, yet seeing nothing. As Dr. Green approached, the sight of the child's distended abdomen caught her breath. This was no ordinary case. The unease that crept through her veins wasn't just medical, it was personal. A child shouldn't be in this position. And yet here she was. A child who should have been playing with toys, now carrying the burden of a life she didn't choose. The mystery of how this happened loomed over the room. But as Dr. Green looked into Emily's empty eyes, she knew one thing for sure: nothing would be the same again. The Oak Ridge Medical Center was a beacon of sterile white light in the otherwise quiet town. The usual bustle of the ER had long since calmed, and the only sounds left in the hospital were the soft beeps of monitors and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. It was 2:47 a.m., and a late winter snowstorm had blanketed the world outside. The streets were eerily empty, the usual sounds of the city muted beneath a thick layer of snow. Inside the emergency room, it felt as though time had slowed. Dr. Sarah Green, though accustomed to the long hours and the tension of night shifts, felt an unusual weight tonight. She sat at the nurse's station, her eyes scanning through patient files, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of a coffee cup that had long cooled. It was the calm before the storm, the moment before everything changed. Sarah had worked countless night shifts in her 14 years as an emergency physician, but something about the stillness of this particular night left her unsettled. The doors to the ER swung open with an almost exaggerated creak, and the soft squeak of gurney wheels echoed through the corridor. 2 paramedics rushed in, their hurried footsteps interrupting the quiet. As they wheeled the stretcher toward the examination area, Sarah's eyes instinctively moved toward them. But what she saw made her heart stop in her chest. On the stretcher lay a small, frail figure. The girl was no more than 9 years old, her face pale and ghostly under the hospital lights. She was still, motionless, her long dark hair matted against her forehead as if it had been there for hours. Her eyes, wide open, stared up at the ceiling, unblinking. She seemed detached from the world, her gaze locked on something far beyond the sterile tiles above her. There was no crying, no signs of discomfort, just an unsettling stillness. Behind the gurney, an older woman walked with shaky steps, gripping the girl's hand tightly. The woman's face was drawn with lines of worry, her eyes clouded with something deeper, guilt, perhaps, or dread. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the stretcher, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone spoke volumes. Sarah could see it, the weight of years, of secrets, of something unspoken between them. The paramedics explained as they moved the girl into the examination room, their voices fading into the background as Sarah's mind processed the situation before her. 7 months pregnant, they said. Pain began hours ago. Her local clinic couldn't handle it. They referred to the girl as Emily, though that name felt too soft, too innocent for what Sarah was about to uncover. Sarah walked to the girl's side, her medical instincts kicking in, but even they couldn't stop the chill that crept up her spine. A child this small shouldn't be in this situation. A child should be playing with dolls or running through the snow outside, not carrying the burden of a life growing inside her. But here, Emily lay, frozen in time, the weight of her situation heavier than anything Sarah had encountered in her years of practice. The nurse prepared the room, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. Sarah moved closer to the gurney, her eyes now fixed on Emily's distended abdomen. There was no denying it, the child was pregnant, nearly full term. Her heart began to race as she felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her. How could this happen? What had brought this child to this point? And who was responsible for the nightmare she now carried with her? The faint sound of the heart monitor broke the silence as Sarah began her examination. There were no visible signs of trauma on Emily's body, no marks, no bruises. Her vitals were steady, if not a bit too calm for someone in her condition. Emily's body was holding on, but the story behind this pregnancy was just beginning to unfold, and it would not be one that Sarah would easily forget. Behind Sarah, the older woman, whom Sarah now recognized as Emily's grandmother, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. She hadn't said a word yet, but Sarah could sense her unease. The grandmother had the look of someone who had known for a long time that something was terribly wrong, but had chosen to ignore it, to pretend it was nothing. Until now. Sarah turned back to Emily, whose gaze never wavered from the ceiling. She could feel the weight of the girl's silence pressing in on the room. This was no ordinary case. There was something deeply tragic here, and Sarah had no idea just how dark the story was about to get. But as she stood in that quiet room, staring at the fragile child before her, she knew one thing: nothing would be the same again. Dr. Sarah Green had spent years in the emergency room, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. As she stood at Emily's side, gently assessing her condition, her mind raced. There were no obvious signs of trauma or injury, but there was something about this case, something in the air, that unsettled her. It wasn't just the pregnancy. It was the silence that hung around Emily, a silence that filled the room with more weight than any medical condition could. Dr. Green was no stranger to tough cases, but this one felt different. Her career had been built on helping people, on fixing problems, but this was not just a physical ailment. It was something deeper. And yet, despite her experience, she found herself unsure of how to approach the girl lying before her. Emily's eyes, wide open and unblinking, reflected a kind of emptiness that made Sarah's heart tighten. This was not the gaze of a child in pain, it was the gaze of someone who had seen far too much. As she moved her hands over the girl's abdomen, checking for any signs of distress, Sarah's thoughts turned to Emily's family. The woman who had been standing silently by the door was Emily's grandmother, Melanie Carter. Sarah had noticed her immediately when the paramedics had wheeled Emily in. Melanie was an older woman, her face worn by years of hard work and struggle. Her expression, now etched with worry and exhaustion, told Sarah that she had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. Melanie had barely spoken since arriving at the hospital, but Sarah could feel her eyes constantly watching, analyzing, waiting for something. It was the look of someone who had seen too many things left unsaid. There was a heavy guilt that radiated off of her, an unspoken fear that Sarah knew she would have to confront sooner or later. As Melanie stood near the bed, her arms crossed over her chest, Sarah found herself wondering how long she had known something was wrong. Had she known about the pregnancy? Or had Emily kept it hidden from her as well? Sarah could feel the weight of the questions hanging in the room, but she had no answers, only more uncertainty. Melanie, Sarah finally spoke, breaking the silence. How long has Emily been like this? The question hung in the air, and Melanie hesitated. She didn't look at Sarah, her eyes fixed on Emily's still form. There was a long pause before she spoke, her voice low and filled with a sadness that seemed to emanate from her very being. She hasn't been herself for months, Melanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. At first I thought it was just growing pains. She's been quieter, more withdrawn. But when the symptoms started showing up, I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to believe it. The guilt in Melanie's voice was unmistakable. She had known something was happening to her granddaughter, but the truth had been too hard to face. Sarah couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Melanie, watching Emily change before her eyes, all the while not knowing what to do about it. Melanie, Sarah began again, her tone softer now, can you tell me what happened? How did Emily end up in this situation? Melanie looked at Sarah for the first time, her gaze filled with both fear and frustration. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know, she murmured, her voice breaking. I never thought it could happen, not to her. Not to Emily. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on Melanie's arm, trying to offer comfort, though she knew it wouldn't be enough. The truth was, Melanie didn't have the answers and Emily wasn't able to speak for herself. This was a puzzle and each piece was scattered, waiting to be put together. Behind Emily's silence, there was a story of fear, of betrayal, and of secrets that had been kept hidden for too long. Sarah could feel it, the tension in the room, the weight of the unspoken truth. But for now all she could do was wait. Wait for Emily to speak, wait for Melanie to open up, and wait for the truth to finally surface. The room felt cold, despite the sterile warmth of the lights above. Emily lay motionless on the hospital gurney, her dark eyes still wide open, staring at the ceiling with an unsettling emptiness. Dr. Sarah Green took a step back, studying her small frame. Her abdomen was unnaturally distended, unmistakably pregnant. 7 months into a pregnancy, according to the paramedics. But this wasn't a case Sarah had prepared for. No textbook or medical training could have prepared her for this. As Sarah continued to observe, she found herself torn between medical protocol and the deep, instinctive need to protect this child. She had seen countless cases of trauma, gunshot wounds, overdoses, heart attacks, but none of them had struck her in this way. Emily wasn't just a patient, she was a tragedy unfolding before her eyes. "Sarah, we've got the ultrasound results," a nurse interrupted, holding up the thin plastic sheet with the scan. Sarah nodded, taking it in her hands. The image on the screen was clear, showing a healthy fetus, its tiny heart beating steadily in the quiet of the room. Everything looked normal, too normal for such an abnormal situation. A child this young shouldn't be pregnant. But she was. And the questions that had been bubbling beneath the surface were now demanding to be answered. Sarah turned her attention back to Emily, whose chest rose and fell with each slow, shallow breath. The girl's body was calm, but there was an overwhelming tension in the air. Sarah's fingers hovered over the patient's pulse, feeling the steady rhythm of life coursing through her veins. Emily was alive, but Sarah had the sense that something vital had already been lost. "Meline, can you tell me where this all started?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but firm. The grandmother had been quiet for most of the examination, standing at the edge of the room as if frozen in place. Now she stepped closer to the gurney, her face etched with concern and something deeper, fear. "She started acting differently a few months ago," Meline began, her voice trembling. She glanced at Emily, whose expression remained vacant. She was quieter, withdrawn. "At first, I thought it was just her growing up. You know how kids get moody?" Sarah nodded, her mind racing as she listened. It wasn't unusual for children to go through phases of withdrawal or moodiness, but this was different. Emily's symptoms seemed more profound, more troubling than typical adolescence. "When did you start to notice the signs?" Sarah pressed, her voice careful, understanding that this was a painful topic. Meline hesitated, her eyes clouding over as though she were searching her own memories for the right words. "It was when she started having stomach pains. I thought it was a stomach bug at first, but the pain wouldn't go away. She got more distant and Meline choked on the words, her throat tightening as she fought to hold back tears. "I didn't know what to think. I didn't want to believe it." Sarah's heart went out to the older woman. She could hear the guilt in Meline's voice, the way she blamed herself for not noticing earlier. But what could she have done? How could anyone have known that her granddaughter, still a child, was carrying another life inside her? There was no way to predict the unimaginable. "You couldn't have known," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on Meline's arm. "No one could have." Meline nodded, her eyes filling with tears as she looked down at Emily, whose face remained expressionless. "I should have asked her more questions. I should have known. But she kept everything so quiet. I thought she was just shy." Sarah was silent for a moment, reflecting on Meline's words. Emily's silence wasn't a typical response to fear or discomfort. It felt deeper, as though the child had built an impenetrable wall around herself. Sarah had seen this before. Trauma had a way of silencing people, especially children. And Emily's trauma was more than just physical pain. It was the deep, emotional wound of carrying a secret so terrible that even speaking about it seemed impossible. "Emily, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, her voice a gentle whisper, "can you tell me what's been happening? We're here to help you, but you have to trust us. We can't help you if you don't tell us what's going on." The girl didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, as though she were lost in a world that Sarah couldn't access. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on them all, and Sarah felt a pang of helplessness in her chest. She wasn't sure how to break through to Emily, but she couldn't let this child remain silent forever. "I know this is hard," Sarah continued, her voice soothing but firm. "But I promise you're safe here. We'll take care of you. We just need you to tell us what happened. It's the only way we can help you heal." Still there was no response. Sarah glanced at Meline, who was watching her granddaughter with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. She had known, or at least suspected, that something was terribly wrong, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Sarah felt a sense of urgency building inside her. The longer Emily remained silent, the harder it would be to understand the full extent of what had happened. But Sarah couldn't rush this. She couldn't force the truth out of Emily, it had to come on the child's terms when she was ready. As Sarah stepped back, the weight of the situation settled over her. This was no ordinary case. This was a crisis that transcended medical boundaries. It was a story of deep trauma, of secrets that had been kept for far too long. And now, Emily's silence was the key to unlocking the dark truth behind the girl's pregnancy. But Sarah knew that breaking that silence wouldn't be easy. And it would take more than just medical expertise. It would take patience, understanding, and compassion, 3 things that would be essential if Emily was ever going to heal. The days that followed Emily's arrival at Oak Ridge Medical Center were filled with uncertainty, fear, and unanswered questions. As Dr. Sarah Green spent more time with her, it became increasingly clear that the young girl was not only physically wounded but emotionally fractured in ways Sarah could hardly imagine. Emily remained mostly silent, her eyes locked on the ceiling as though she were caught in a world of her own, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the reality surrounding her. Sarah knew that breaking through that silence would be key to understanding what had happened. But how could she reach a child who seemed to have shut herself off entirely? Despite the lack of communication, Sarah wasn't without clues. Emily's body was strong, though fragile in its own way. The pregnancy had progressed to the 7th month, and the fetus appeared healthy. The tests had shown no signs of trauma or abuse that could explain how Emily came to be pregnant. There were no physical injuries, no signs of forced entry into her life. Yet the deep emotional scars, the ones that had made her retreat into this silence, were there, lingering just beneath the surface. Sarah had seen children who had been through trauma before. She had worked with young patients who had suffered abuse, abandonment, and neglect. But Emily was different. There was something about her that spoke of a deeper, more hidden pain. Something that went beyond just what could be seen on a scan or measured with a stethoscope. Emily's withdrawal wasn't just emotional, it was a defense mechanism, an invisible wall she had built to protect herself from a world she no longer trusted. And Sarah could feel the weight of it. Emily's grandmother, Meline, had become a more frequent presence at the hospital. She would sit by Emily's side, her face etched with worry, her eyes filled with regret. Meline had opened up more about her fears, her suspicions, and the ways in which Emily's behavior had changed over the past few months. But even Meline's words felt like fragments of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. What had happened? How had Emily ended up in this situation? The more Sarah listened to Meline's account, the more questions she had, and the fewer answers seemed to appear. It wasn't long before the quiet, empty hospital room began to feel like a pressure cooker, the silence and uncertainty mounting with each passing day. Emily's condition remained stable, but the emotional toll was starting to show. The girl had stopped eating for days. She refused to speak to anyone, even when Meline would try to coax her with comforting words. Emily had simply withdrawn further, retreating into herself like a wounded animal hiding from the world. Sarah knew that the longer Emily remained in this state, the harder it would be to get through to her. But she couldn't rush it. Healing, especially for a child who had been through such an unimaginable ordeal, wasn't something that could be forced. It was something that had to unfold at its own pace in its own time. But every moment Emily stayed silent felt like another moment that the truth, the key to understanding what had happened, slipped further out of reach. A breakthrough came one morning, several days into Emily's stay at Oak Ridge Medical Center. Sarah had just finished her rounds and was walking down the hallway when she noticed Meline sitting by Emily's bed. She was hunched over, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. It was the first time Sarah had seen the older woman so openly vulnerable. Meline's usual stoicism had cracked, revealing a deep reservoir of grief and guilt. Sarah stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should she offer comfort? Or should she wait for Meline to open up on her own terms? But before Sarah could take a step forward, she heard a sound, a soft, barely audible voice coming from the bed. It was the first time Emily had spoken in days. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse as though the words had been trapped inside her for too long. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Emily was talking. She was finally breaking the silence. Meline's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of hope and pain. "Emily," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to apologize. We're here to help you." Emily turned her head slightly toward her grandmother, her eyes vacant, but there was something in the way she looked at Meline that made Sarah's heart ache. Emily wasn't just sorry, she was ashamed. She wasn't apologizing for the pain she had endured, she was apologizing for something she felt responsible for. The silence hung in the air for a moment longer, heavy with unspoken words. Sarah stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "You're safe here, Emily. Whatever happened, we're going to help you." But Emily didn't respond. She didn't nod or speak further. She simply lay there, her gaze unfocused, her body still. Sarah could sense the emotional wall Emily had built around herself, and she knew it wasn't going to come down easily. The girl had suffered more than Sarah could ever understand, and her silence wasn't just a refusal to speak, it was a shield, a way to protect herself from the pain that had been inflicted upon her. Over the next few days, Emily remained in a state of limbo, neither improving nor deteriorating. She wasn't eating or drinking much, and her communication was limited to the rare, almost imperceptible word or gesture. Yet there was something different now, a slight shift, a subtle change in the air. Emily had started to respond to her grandmother's presence, her eyes following Meline when she moved around the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to offer Sarah a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Emily was beginning to trust them again. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Emily's silence was not something that could be broken in a single moment. It would take time to rebuild the trust, time to uncover the truth, and time to heal the emotional wounds that had been inflicted upon this child. But for the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to believe that Emily's healing could begin. The days dragged on, but Emily's condition remained stable. Her silence, though still present, became less oppressive. The nurse noticed small changes. Emily eating a little more, responding to questions with a simple nod or shake of the head, even making eye contact occasionally. The emotional distance was still there, but it was beginning to shrink piece by piece. And then one afternoon, as Sarah walked into Emily's room to check on her, she found the girl holding a small sketchpad in her hands. Emily's fingers moved slowly, almost mechanically, as she drew. Sarah stood in the doorway, hesitant to interrupt. For the first time in days, Emily was engaging with the world around her. Her silence had shifted into something else, something that Sarah could work with. Sarah quietly crossed the room and sat down beside Emily's bed. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Emily didn't look up, but her pencil continued to move across the page. The lines were hesitant, uncertain, but Sarah could see the beginnings of something. A house, a door, windows. "Is this where you live?" Sarah asked, trying to guide the conversation without pushing too hard. Emily's hand paused for a moment, but then she nodded. The drawing was simple, almost childlike in its innocence. But Sarah could see something darker within it. The windows were shut tightly and the door was locked, the lines harsh and bold. "I see," Sarah whispered, watching as Emily continued to sketch. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a window into Emily's mind, a glimpse of the world she had been forced to live in. The tension had not yet been fully broken, but Sarah could feel it. The small steps, the subtle shifts, were signs that Emily's silence was beginning to give way to something else. And for the first time, Sarah had hoped that the girl would one day find her voice again. The tension in the hospital room slowly began to shift. Emily's small steps toward breaking her silence were not only a relief to Dr. Sarah Green but also a pivotal moment for her grandmother, Meline, who had quietly stood by, watching, waiting for the right time to reach out to her granddaughter. Yet, in the days following Emily's subtle breakthroughs, Sarah noticed something was amiss with Meline, something more than the protective, worried look she had worn since the moment Emily arrived. It was more than just concern for her granddaughter, it was guilt. A deep, unsettling guilt that Meline couldn't hide. Sarah had been observing Meline more closely now, as the older woman spent more time by Emily's side. There was a visible struggle within Meline, as though she was fighting an inner battle that she couldn't, or wouldn't, speak about. Every time she looked at Emily, Sarah could see the unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Yet Meline remained silent, her eyes brimming with regret. One evening, after Sarah had finished her rounds and was heading toward the nurse's station, she found Meline sitting alone in the hospital's small waiting area, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the vending machines in the corner and the distant sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. Meline was staring at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her jacket. Sarah paused in the doorway, unsure whether to approach. She knew Meline was struggling, but she wasn't sure if now was the right moment to offer comfort, or if Meline was ready to talk. Meline hadn't shared much about her life before the hospital, but Sarah had gathered that the older woman had raised Emily in a home filled with secrets and unspoken tension. It was as if the past had a hold on both of them, and no one had dared to confront it. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, Sarah made her way over to Meline and sat down beside her. "Meline, how are you holding up?" she asked gently, keeping her voice soft and non-intrusive. Meline gave a small, strained smile but didn't meet Sarah's eyes. "It's hard," she replied quietly. I've been so afraid of what might come out. I've spent years trying to protect Emily from everything, and now," her voice trailed off and she let out a shaky sigh, "I feel like I failed her." Sarah studied Meline for a moment, sensing that this conversation was more important than any medical treatment she could offer. "You've been there for her?" Sarah said softly. You're here now and you're doing everything you can to help her. That's all anyone can do. Meline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. It's not enough. I should have done more. I should have seen it sooner. What do you mean? Sarah asked, leaning forward slightly, her tone gentle but insistent. What should you have seen? Meline wiped her eyes and glanced down at the floor. There was a long pause before she spoke again, as though she was choosing her words carefully. There's something I didn't tell you, Dr. Green? Something I've kept hidden from everyone, including Emily. She took a shaky breath before continuing. When Emily was younger, her father, my son Mark, he wasn't around much. He was always distant, wrapped up in his own issues. But when he was here, he wasn't the man I wanted him to be. He wasn't a good man. He had his demons, alcohol, drugs, and he took them out on Emily. Sarah's heart tightened. She had suspected there was more to Emily's story than met the eye, but hearing it from Meline, hearing about the abuse Emily had likely endured, was a sobering reality. She had assumed that Emily's silence was a result of trauma, but now she knew the depth of the pain the child had carried with her for so long. Meline's voice broke as she spoke. I tried to protect her, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop him. And when he left, when he disappeared, it was like a weight was lifted, but I never got the chance to tell Emily how sorry I was. I never told her how much I regret not doing more. Sarah sat silently, absorbing Meline's words. This wasn't just the story of a child who had been neglected. It was the story of a family torn apart by dysfunction and abuse. Meline had done what she could to protect Emily, but in doing so, she had kept her own secrets. Secrets that were now coming to light in the most painful of ways. Meline, Sarah said after a moment, her voice soft, it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of guilt. But you can't change the past. What you can do now is help Emily heal. She needs you more than ever, and I can see that you're trying to do the right thing. Meline nodded, her shoulders trembling as the weight of her past seemed to fall upon her all at once. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that were threatening to spill over. I don't know how to make it right. I don't know how to fix all the things that went wrong. You don't have to fix everything at once, Sarah replied. Healing takes time. But the fact that you're here, that you're trying, Emily will feel that. She'll know you're doing your best, and that's all anyone can ask for. There was a long silence between them before Meline finally spoke again. I don't want Emily to be like me, she whispered. I don't want her to carry the same mistakes I made. You won't be, Sarah reassured her. You're breaking the cycle. And together we can help Emily heal. As Meline wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath, Sarah knew this conversation was just the beginning. Meline's guilt and her past were powerful forces, but now that the truth was beginning to surface, there was a chance for Emily, and for Meline, to begin the healing process. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. And sometimes that was all they needed. The days after Meline's revelation felt like a strange turning point for both her and Emily. The hospital room, once filled with silence and tension, began to take on a different energy, one that was tentative yet filled with the potential for change. But despite Meline's attempts to open up and offer comfort to Emily, there was still a wall between them, one that remained unbroken. Emily had begun to speak again, but only in fragments. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Sarah, it was a sign, perhaps a faint one, that progress was being made. Emily's silence was still overwhelming. Each conversation with Meline or Sarah was met with soft nods or the occasional whisper, but nothing more. She remained distant, her eyes often drifting away as if she were trapped in a world of her own. Despite the few words that had been exchanged in the past week, Emily was still not ready to fully confront the reality of what had happened to her. And Sarah knew that it wasn't just about physical healing, it was about the emotional scars that had yet to be addressed. One late afternoon, as the hospital's fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over the sterile white walls of the room, a breakthrough occurred, though it wasn't what Sarah had expected. Emily, for the first time, picked up the small sketchpad that had become a tool for expressing her feelings, and she began to draw again. This time, however, it was different. The drawings were no longer simple sketches of a house with locked doors or closed windows. This time, Emily's hand moved with purpose, her fingers pressing the pencil into the paper with a rawness that Sarah couldn't ignore. She wasn't just drawing a house anymore, she was drawing something darker, something more complex. Sarah stood by the door, watching quietly as Emily's pencil moved across the page, her face an expression of concentration. She didn't want to interrupt, but she could feel the gravity of the moment. This was it, the key to unlocking the silence that had held Emily captive for so long. If Emily was willing to draw this, Perhaps she was ready to confront the truth. Slowly, Sarah approached Emily's bedside and sat down across from her. "Emily," she began softly, her voice steady, "can I see what you're drawing?" At first there was no response. Emily didn't look up or acknowledge her. She simply kept drawing, the pencil moving in quick, harsh strokes. But Sarah could sense the shift, the change in Emily's demeanor. The lines on the paper became sharper, more intense, as though the child were putting everything she had inside her into the drawing. It wasn't until Emily had finished that she slowly pushed the sketchpad toward Sarah. Her eyes never left the floor, but there was a vulnerability in the way she presented the drawing that hadn't been there before. As Sarah picked it up, she felt the weight of the image she was about to see. The drawing was a figure, a silhouette, perhaps, of someone standing in a doorway. The figure was dark, their face obscured in shadow, their hands outstretched as if reaching for something. Behind the figure was a faint outline of a child, smaller and more delicate. The lines of the drawing were jagged, uneven, as if Emily had been struggling to depict something she didn't fully understand. Sarah's eyes moved from the drawing to Emily's face. The girl's expression had softened slightly, but the fear that had been hiding there was undeniable. The drawing wasn't just a depiction of what Emily had seen, it was a symbol of what she had lived through. The figure in the doorway represented the fear and the trauma that had been locked away for so long. It wasn't just a drawing, it was Emily's way of saying that she was ready to face it. "What is this, Emily?" Sarah asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, Emily remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. But then, in a voice that barely broke the silence, she spoke. "It's him," she whispered. "He always stood in the doorway. I could hear his footsteps and I knew he was coming." Her voice faltered as though the words were ripping through her, but she continued. "I was scared. I wanted to run but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape." Sarah's heart broke for the girl who had been carrying this burden in silence for so long. She had known, deep down, that the trauma Emily had experienced went far beyond the pregnancy. There was something much darker at play here, something that had been suffocating Emily, and now, for the first time, Emily was speaking it aloud. Sarah swallowed hard, her own emotions threatening to surface. "Emily, you don't have to be afraid anymore," she said softly. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you. You're in a place where you can heal." But Emily didn't respond. She simply stared at the drawing, her fingers twisting the edges of the paper as though she were trying to tear it apart. The weight of what she had just said hung in the air, and for the first time since Emily had been brought to the hospital, Sarah understood the depth of her pain. This wasn't just about a pregnancy, it was about years of fear, isolation, and trauma. Emily wasn't just struggling with the aftermath of a horrible event, she was fighting to break free from the emotional prison that had held her captive for so long. The truth was finally out in the open. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a start. Emily had taken the first step toward healing, toward confronting the truth. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But this moment when Emily had finally spoken, even if through a drawing, marked a shift. It was the beginning of something new. Something that would allow Emily to reclaim her voice, her story, and her future. The following days after Emily's drawing felt like a long, heavy breath. One that held within it both the promise of something better and the danger of what might still be lurking in the dark corners of Emily's mind. Sarah had known, from the moment Emily whispered those haunting words about the figure in the doorway, that this was only the beginning of a much longer and more painful process. But something about that moment, something about the drawing and the quiet, broken way Emily had spoken, felt like the breakthrough they had all been waiting for. It wasn't a resolution, it was only the first step toward it. The tension in the hospital room began to shift. Emily, though still quiet, had started to respond more. She ate more regularly, even though her food choices remained minimal. She still kept mostly to herself, her eyes often unfocused, as though she were lost in a place only she could see. But her interactions with Meline had become more frequent, and her fragile attempts at connecting with Sarah began to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to confront what had been done to her, and that in itself was a painful but necessary part of the healing process. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Sarah sat at her desk reviewing patient charts, she received a phone call that would change everything. It was from the social worker assigned to Emily's case. Her voice was urgent, tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "Dr. Green, I think we need to talk," the social worker said, her tone serious. "There's something we need to address, something that I don't think we've fully explored yet." Sarah's heart skipped a beat and she felt her stomach twist. "What do you mean? Is Emily okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the social worker spoke again, more slowly this time. I just spoke with Meline and I think there's something you need to know. We're going to need to talk about the father. Sarah froze. The father. The word sent a chill down her spine. In all the weeks since Emily had been admitted to Oak Ridge, Sarah had never heard much about the father. Meline had mentioned him briefly, but the conversation had always been carefully avoided. Something told Sarah that this was the missing piece, the one that would finally make sense of everything. She stood up abruptly, gathering her things. I'll be right there, she said, her voice firm. When Sarah entered Emily's room, she found Meline sitting by her granddaughter's side. Emily was curled up on the bed, her eyes closed, her face turned toward the window as though she were lost in thought. Meline looked up as Sarah entered, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. The grandmother's hands trembled as she placed them in her lap, a look of apprehension clouding her features. Meline, Sarah said softly, walking over to sit beside her. What's going on? I just spoke with the social worker. She said we need to discuss something about Emily's father. Meline's face grew darker as she glanced at Emily, who remained unaware of the conversation unfolding around her. The weight of unspoken words hung heavily in the air. He's dead, Meline said, her voice cracking as she spoke. Mark, Emily's father, died 3 years ago. But the truth is, he's never really been gone. Not in the way you think. She paused, struggling to find the right words. Mark was abusive. He was violent. And after he left, it didn't just stop. Emily kept the memories, kept the fear. I think it's been haunting her all this time, even after he was gone. Sarah's stomach tightened. She had suspected something terrible had happened, but hearing the truth from Meline's lips was like a punch to the gut. Mark had been the cause of Emily's trauma, the shadow in the doorway, the figure that had driven her into silence. Meline continued, her voice barely above a whisper. After Mark left, Emily didn't talk about him. She didn't tell me what he had done, what he had said to her. She just shut down and I let her. I thought she'd forget, that she'd move on. But I see now that she's never really left that place. She's still trapped in it. Sarah's eyes moved to Emily, whose stillness now seemed less like peace and more like a carefully constructed facade. She had been hiding from the truth just as Meline had been. But now the truth was out and the weight of it was suffocating. I should have done more, Meline whispered, her voice cracking. I should have told someone, gotten help. But I was too scared, too afraid of losing her. And now look at her. Look what's happened. Sarah reached out and placed a hand on Meline's shoulder, offering the only comfort she could. You couldn't have known, Meline. No one could have. You did the best you could. But deep inside, Sarah knew that Meline's guilt would not be so easily assuaged. They were both facing the aftermath of years of silence, and Emily was the one who had borne the brunt of it all. Just as Sarah began to respond, she noticed Emily stir. The girl shifted slightly on the bed, her eyes fluttering open. Her gaze immediately found Sarah's, and for the first time, Sarah saw something different in her eyes. It was as if Emily had just woken up, as though she were finally able to see what had been happening around her. Emily? Sarah said softly, leaning forward. Do you want to talk? Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking between Sarah and Meline. The silence between them was thick, almost unbearable, as though the weight of their shared history hung between them all. But then, slowly, Emily sat up, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the blanket. She whispered, her voice rough from lack of use. I don't know how to say it, but I need to tell you. I need you to know what happened. The room fell silent as Emily began to speak. Her voice was small, fragile, but it was there. She was speaking her truth. My dad, she began, her voice faltering. He hurt me. He did things to me that I don't want to remember. But I can't forget them. I can't get them out of my head. Her words trembled with pain, but she continued, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. He told me it was my fault. That I had to keep it a secret. He said he'd make everything worse if I told anyone. Sarah's heart ached for Emily. The pain in her words was a direct reflection of the horrors she had endured. But hearing her speak, hearing her finally confront the truth, was a turning point, both for Emily and for everyone around her. I didn't know what to do, Emily whispered, tears beginning to fall down her cheeks. I thought I was the one hurting everyone. I didn't want to tell you, Grandma. I didn't want you to hate me. Meline's face crumpled as she reached out to Emily, her hands trembling. Oh, Emily, she sobbed. You were never the problem. You never did anything wrong. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to be held. She clung to Meline, her body shaking with the weight of everything she had been holding in for so long. It was as though the floodgates had opened and there was no turning back. But as the tears fell, something else began to emerge, something Sarah hadn't expected. It was a feeling of relief, of release, of freedom. Emily was finally speaking, finally allowing herself to confront what had happened, and it was in this moment that Sarah realized they were not just treating a physical injury, they were witnessing the beginning of a healing process, a long journey toward reclaiming the life Emily had lost. The aftermath of Emily's revelation was like a storm clearing from the sky, a sharp, overwhelming shift in the atmosphere. In the days following her confession, Sarah could feel a tangible change in the hospital room. Emily, once so silent and distant, had begun to take tentative steps toward healing. It was still a long road ahead, but the first hurdle had been crossed. Emily had spoken. She had faced the truth that had been buried so deep inside her, and although it was only the beginning, it felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, the walls surrounding her heart began to crumble, if only slightly. Sarah had been on edge ever since that moment, knowing that this wasn't a one-time breakthrough. Emily's journey was just beginning, and the healing process would take time, patience, and compassion. It wasn't going to be easy, no trauma ever was, but Emily had made a monumental step. She had finally spoken, and with those words came the possibility of real recovery. The days following the confession were a blur of appointments, therapy sessions, and meetings with counselors. Sarah worked closely with Emily's social worker and psychologist, trying to create a plan that would best support her healing. The goal was clear: to provide Emily with a safe space where she could process her trauma at her own pace, where she could feel understood and supported. But as Sarah worked tirelessly to ensure that Emily had every resource she needed, one thing became evident: healing was not a linear process. There would be setbacks. There would be moments of doubt. But Emily was no longer facing her trauma alone. She had the support of Sarah, Meline, and the rest of the hospital staff. Meline, too, was making her own journey toward healing. Sarah had noticed the change in her since Emily had spoken the truth. The guilt that had once consumed her had started to lessen, though it was still present. Meline spent hours with Emily, holding her hand, talking to her, and reassuring her that she was not alone. They spent hours in silence together, the bond between them growing stronger with every passing day. The silence between them, once so heavy and filled with unspoken regret, had shifted. It was now filled with the promise of a future where healing could begin. One evening, after a long therapy session, Meline sat by Emily's bed as Sarah entered the room. There was a soft, peaceful calm in the air, a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had once permeated every inch of the room. Emily was lying on her side, curled into a small ball under the covers, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. Meline sat in a chair beside her, her eyes soft but tired. Sarah could see that the woman had been crying, though there was a sense of release in her tears. She had let go of the guilt at least a little, and now she was ready to support her granddaughter fully. "How is she?" Sarah asked quietly as she sat beside Meline, her eyes on Emily. "She's doing better," Meline replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not easy for her. But she's trying, Sarah. She's trying, and that's all I can ask for." Meline's voice faltered, and Sarah reached out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight of understanding. Meline had spent years struggling with her own guilt, and now for the first time she had the chance to make things right. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Sarah had no doubt that Meline would do everything she could to help her granddaughter heal. "Emily's strong," Sarah said softly. "You've both been through so much, but you're not alone anymore. The healing starts here together." Meline nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I know. I just wish I had seen the signs earlier. I wish I had known what was happening." Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. "You did the best you could. Sometimes, it's not easy to see the signs, especially when the person you love is trying to protect you by staying silent. But now you're here and that's what matters." Meline sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I just want her to be okay. I want her to be happy again." "She will be," Sarah said firmly. "It'll take time, but she'll get there. You both will." The next few weeks passed in a blur of therapy sessions, family meetings, and counseling. Emily's progress was slow but steady. The nightmares, the flashbacks, and the panic attacks were still there, but with each passing day, Emily seemed to become a little stronger. She was more present in the world around her, more willing to engage with those who were there to help her. She smiled more often, even if the smiles were small and hesitant. But Sarah could see the change. and it was enough to fuel her determination to help Emily through the rest of her journey. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional therapy session, Emily approached Sarah in the hospital hallway. Sarah had just finished her rounds and was heading to her office when she noticed Emily standing near the nurse's station, her hands nervously twisting together. "Hey, Emily," Sarah greeted her gently, her voice warm and comforting. "How are you feeling?" Emily hesitated for a moment before looking up at Sarah. There was still a sadness in her eyes, but there was also something new, something that Sarah hadn't seen before. It was a flicker of hope. Emily's lips parted as though she were trying to find the right words. Sarah could see her hesitation, but she also saw her courage. The courage to try to fight for her healing. "I'm okay," Emily said softly, her voice still quiet but no longer hollow. "It's hard, but I'm trying." Sarah smiled gently, nodding. "That's all anyone can ask for. You're doing great, Emily." Emily glanced down at her hands, then back up at Sarah. "I want to get better," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I want to move on. I want to be happy again." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. It was the first time Emily had voiced her desire to heal, to live a life beyond the trauma that had defined her existence for so long. "You will," Sarah said, her voice firm with conviction. "You're already on the path. Healing takes time, but you're not doing it alone. You've got your family, your friends, and everyone here at the hospital supporting you." Emily gave a small, tentative nod, her eyes shining with the faintest glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah knelt down to her level, making sure Emily could see the sincerity in her eyes. "You're welcome. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. We'll be here every step of the way." As Sarah stood up and watched Emily walk back toward her room, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Emily had taken another step forward in her healing journey. And though the road ahead was long and filled with challenges, Sarah knew that Emily had the strength to keep going. The room that had once been filled with silence and fear was now filled with a quiet, tentative hope. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live again. And that, in itself, was a victory. The journey from darkness into light is never easy, especially for someone as young as Emily. But as Sarah stood in the doorway of Emily's hospital room one quiet evening, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The walls of silence that had once trapped Emily had begun to crumble. Emily, though still carrying the weight of her past, had found her voice. And in that voice, there was power, power to heal, to confront, and to reclaim a life that had been stolen from her. The journey wasn't over. It would take time, patience, and resilience. Emily's wounds, both seen and unseen, would require more than just medical care. But the key to her healing had always been there, inside her. The truth, painful and raw, had been spoken. The silence, which had been her prison, had begun to lose its hold. Meline, too, had started her own journey. As a grandmother, a protector, and a mother who had been unable to shield her granddaughter from the storm, Meline had found the courage to face her own regrets. She couldn't undo the past, but she could work toward building a future where healing wasn't just a hope, it was a reality. Meline's love, though it had been shrouded in guilt and fear, had become the steady anchor Emily needed to move forward. In the days that followed, Emily and Meline grew closer. Their shared silence had once been filled with a distance too vast to cross. But now there was understanding. There was communication not just through words but through presence, touch, and the quiet support that spoke louder than any words could. For Emily, this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she could rebuild herself, reclaim her strength, and ultimately, live a life not defined by the trauma she had suffered, but by the resilience she had shown. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and there would be days when the pain resurfaced. But now she wasn't alone in it. And for Sarah, watching Emily take these steps toward healing was a reminder of why she chose medicine in the first place. To help people not just recover from physical wounds, but to heal from the wounds that ran deeper than skin. To watch someone reclaim their life, their voice, and their future was the truest form of healing.